the Cato Institute. My name is Walter Olson. I'm Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute in the Robert A. Levy Center for Constitutional Studies, and I write a lot about election law. We are here today to discuss ranked choice voting in the recent New York City primary election, what lessons there may be in that. And I'm joined today by three distinguished guests. They are Megan McArdle, columnist with the Washington Post, David Daley, independent author of books and senior fellow at FairVote, and John Ketchum of the Manhattan Institute. We will be giving brief remarks, each of us, and then having a conversation prompted in part by what each other have said. We will get eventually to your questions, and I want to talk a little bit about your questions because you are free to submit them anytime during the course of the program. You can submit questions via the Cato Institute's own webpage, via Cato's pages on YouTube or Facebook or X, Twitter. So don't wait till the end if you've got a good question. Please submit it. We especially welcome questions that tie in with what the four of us have had to say, but don't feel limited to that. So let me introduce the three guests in a little more detail. You will find, I think, that they have three very different points of view. Megan McArdle is a columnist for the Washington Post, where she writes about economics, business, public policy, and many other things. She has worked for such publications as The Atlantic, The Daily Beast, and Bloomberg View, and she made her name originally with a blog that launched in November 2001 called Live from the World Trade Center. I was one of her readers, as well as being another early blogger back then, one of her readers from very early on, and that took her to a career in mainstream media, and she's taken part in many panels and podcasts here at Cato, and she has also been a fellow at the public policy think tank New America. David Daley is the author of the new book, Anti-Democratic, on voting rights and the U.S. Supreme Court, and the author of an earlier book on gerrymandering that became a national bestseller. I'm not going to name that book. He is a senior fellow at FairVote, the election reform organization, and the former editor-in-chief at Salon. His writing has appeared in The New Yorker and The Atlantic, and you may have seen his opinion piece yesterday in the Washington Post on the gerrymandering wars. He has taught political science and journalism at Wesleyan, Boston College, and Smith College. John Ketchum is Legal Policy Fellow and Director of Cities at the Manhattan Institute, my old stomping grounds before I came to Cato. He writes often on issues of local governance and elections in New York City, state, and beyond. He holds a JD from Harvard Law School, where he was managing editor of the Federalist Society's excellent publication, the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy. While in law school, John spent a summer in what I have to say is about the coolest summer job I've ever heard of in my life. He spent a summer at the Permanent Observer Mission of the Holy See to the United Nations. And I'll bet he has stories. His writing has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Daily News, the New York Post, and elsewhere, and he is active in many civic organizations in New York City. So please join me in welcoming our three guests. And Megan, why don't you go first?
Sure. So I am not exactly an opponent of ranked choice voting and also not exactly a supporter. I understand the arguments for it, the ways in which it is supposed to tamp down certain kinds of both voting failures, where people are not getting the candidate they want, and also tamp down the negative campaigning that has come to characterize United States politics in the last 20 years to our distress. I have some skepticism on very high level grounds. First of all, while it does solve some voting failures, it creates others, as happened in Burlington, Vermont in 2009, where the candidate that most people wanted didn't get elected as a result of something called a center squeeze, which is another kind of voting failure. There is no perfect voting system. I think Arrow basically proved that decades ago, and I think that still holds true. I'll also tend to be a little skeptical of innovations. In part, this is because I am old, and I was just rereading the Brookings paper from 2001, which showed that old people oppose ranked choice voting more than young people because they get confused by it. But more broadly, I think that the history of good governance reforms has often had some unexpected side effects, especially when it collides with other unique features of the United States voting system. And the examples are the go-to examples that I'm sure many of you have heard before. Things like primaries. Sounds great. Let's make the parties more responsive to voters. In fact, turned out to select for extremists because most people don't vote in the primaries. Campaign finance reform. Let's make the system less responsive to money, more responsive to voters. Well, it turns out that what it did was got the parties, and without the parties to implement kind of institutional discipline, what you ended up with was parties that were weak and both unable to exert control over candidates, who would then have bad brand effects on candidates in other races when they were crazy, as has happened to the Republican Party, especially in the last couple decades, but also that it impeded legislative deal making. The parties in a system play an important role because they are in a repeat game in a way that the legislators are not, and they have broader interests than individual legislators. And that's what I'll close with as my final point on ranked choice voting. What I am not clear about when I look at it is, what is the impact on parties? There was supposed to be an argument that this is going to select for positive campaigning and more moderate candidates. And certainly, I think we have seen some evidence for that in Alaska. On the other hand, what are we to make of what happened in New York, where I would call Zohran Mamdani many things, but the most moderate candidate is not one of them. It selects for charismatic people who can stand out from a crowded field. Donald Trump was one of those people, not selected by ranked choice voting, but selected in a similar dynamic where you've got a lot of people on stage and the most telegenic person kind of wins the race. Not even because he was the majority choice of Republican voters. He absolutely was not in 2016, but because he really knew how to work a camera. He had name recognition. He had a bunch of benefits that allowed him to stand out. I have some concerns about that happening again in ranked choice voting. And I think that we have sort of seen that with Zohran Mamdani, who, whether you like him more or less than Trump, displays a lot of the similar characteristics. Very charismatic, very good at media. And then I ask, what does this do to the parties? Because we still do need the parties to do legislative deal making. The United States system, especially in a mixed system where most places are not ranked choice, is going to need parties that are capable of making deals. And historically, the way that has happened is through party whipping, through these institutional checks that ranked choice voting, I think pretty much everyone agrees, weakens. That you can be a less partisan, more moderate, have a somewhat unique to you personal voting base, which may be good on some sides. But I think for the party, that might turn to be a drawback. And while I have massive quarrels with our existing parties, I also have looked at the history of the last 20 years and thought that what I would have thought in 2000, which is, yes, weaker parties, that would be great, has actually not turned out to be so great. It has created a lot of perverse incentives, especially in a system that is dominated by kind of the need to get media, to get earned media, where that's and I think we already see a lot of legislators using Congress as a platform for performance rather than as a place to do legislative work. And one of my concerns with ranked choice voting is that you end up with more of that. That the incentives that it creates for candidates, I'm not denying that it has worked in Australia and in other places, but that on a national scale, if this were widely implemented, we might see some pretty unintended side effects. And that tends to make me small c conservative about changes like this. Not totally unopen to them, but a little worried about messing with the system we have in favor of a system that might or might not be better after we've actually gotten through the full implementation. And I'll stop there.
Well, thank you, Megan. And I'm going to take moderator's prerogative of deciding who goes in what order and be the second person myself. There are only a couple of points on which I might engage with what Megan had to say, but this was the second outing for ranked choice voting in New York City. And of course, the first outing elected Mayor Eric Adams in another kind of exciting race that had the national political audience looking closely, and from which a lot of people drew that conclusion that maybe moderates do better under ranked choice voting, a conclusion that was also made easier by the Alaska and Maine experience and some others. And Of course, those who too confidently said, you see, ranked choice voting is better for moderate candidates, were left with egg on their face. That back they had to go to the drawing board. Oops. And I have to say, I was never one of those people because I think, in line with Megan's observations, I was always cautioning people who expected moderation that ranked choice voting rewarded a different kind of candidate who could put together different kinds of voters. And I said, you may think that your favorite candidates, or, I like Larry Hogan, he's that kind of candidate, but so is Bernie Sanders, so is Ronald Reagan, so is Donald Trump. All of those people were very good at pulling over people who did not usually vote in their party's primaries or usually did not come out. Well, what is it? Some of it is charisma. Some of it is simply shrewdly identifying that a new coalition can be built, not necessarily consisting of moderate positions on things, but as with Sanders, for example, pulling some conservative immigration positions and welding them together with some non-conservative positions. So I said, watch out. Do not expect the reign of the people who were at the 50th percentile of ideology on this. And so I was less surprised when Mamdani came through. Well, the next question that people began asking is, did ranked choice voting even make a difference? Mamdani's margin over Andrew Cuomo was such that clearly, in a first past the post traditional election system without ranked choice voting, he would have come in well ahead. There wouldn't have been any second choice redistribution, but same candidate wins. And all I'll say about that is that in interviews ever since, Mamdani himself, I believe, and his campaign people all believed that RCV did make a difference. They said that they ran an RCV campaign, one that was informed by what the system allowed them to do, how it allowed them to campaign. And two examples of that. They reached out, made a big strategic point of reaching out to other candidates in the primary, not obviously Andrew Cuomo, who they correctly identified as the opponent, but to the various others, and succeeded in getting various events at which there were cross endorsements for second and third choices. And they've most often cited Brad Lander, who was indeed the third most popular candidate, New York City's comptroller, so a figure who was really much better known than Mamdani himself, and also the figure that represented the left. But getting Mamdani and Lander onto the same podium to cross-endorse with RCV as second choices gave Mamdani a big boost. And as I say, I'm drawing this from his own people. It said that it reassured some constituents who had been uncertain, for example, on the issue of executive experience. Mamdani has been a state legislator in Albany. I could write the campaign ads about how someone should not be handed the reins of an enormous government and all of the executive responsibilities. But there was Brad Lander, one of the actual people who has to make administration work in New York City, saying, yes, I trust him. Yes, he'll bring in people who will correct for whatever weakness there may be there. In a very important endorsement. And then they also saw Lander as being important in reassuring some wavering Jewish voters who might not have felt that they trusted Mamdani enough. And of course, that was a very important group that he conquered and did well with as part of winning. So, and the second way in which they used it was not coming from Mamdani's campaign directly. It was outside groups who were organizing a Don't Rank Andrew Cuomo campaign. They had more colorful terms for it, but the idea was they were putting together slates of 5 people, none of whom were Andrew Cuomo, and saying, get to know these obscure people. Even they are better than Andrew Cuomo. So as a negative campaign, it was an oddly positive campaign. It involved, increase in the visibility of various also rounds. And it seems to have worked very well. It got the reasons to vote against Cuomo talked about in a novel way and in a way that allowed people to compare notes about, well, are you sure that third and fourth person are in the right order? So what is significant, I think, and some of this is probably just personality, but I still think that, as exactly as Megan said, personality is very important in who makes it through this obstacle course. Cuomo did not run an RCV campaign. When two of the smaller candidates or lesser known candidates endorsed him, he did not take the hint and get up there and cross endorse them, saying, hey, you should use some of your ranking choices for them, let alone numbers 2 and 3. He was aloof. He felt above it all. He felt that as the national celebrity, whom everyone had already formed an opinion, he had nothing to gain by associating himself too closely with people who weren't even celebrities. Now, this reminded me, I have to say, although ideological colors are reversed here, but it reminded me of the other most visible ranked choice voting race that most people will know about, and the other one in which a big national celebrity was running, namely Sarah Palin trying to run for U.S. House from Alaska. And she also stayed aloof. She also, at least in that first RCV election, said not to bother using a second choice vote to rank her Republican rival, who was a more sort of, I don't know whether mainstream is the right word. He was a more normal, average kind of Republican, Nick Begich. She also seemed to consider the RCV process beneath her. Well, voters reacted very negatively. Now, in both cases, you can say there were 100 other reasons why voters could react negatively, but still, 2 data points. Remember, how many of us have run with 2 data points? I know I've done it for a column. So that that certainly suggests to me that one of the lessons of that we now have is if you've got the system in your city or state, you'd better campaign aware of that system, and you better campaign the way the system is encouraging you to. Now, with that, I will turn it over to David.
Thank you, Walter. Pleasure to be here. Grateful to be with John and Megan, two people I've been reading for so long, and Walter, who's been my good friend and ally in the redistricting battles. I think we can all be grateful, right, for one thing, that we are not just wrapping up the runoff election that we would have been having in New York for the previous 6 weeks without a ranked choice that would have cost millions, probably ended up with the same result, dramatically less turnout. Since we are here with the Cato Institute, I want to emphasize how ranked choice voting makes elections better by turning more choices into a good thing rather than into an existential crisis, that this is a powerful tool for voters in any election with more than 2 choices, because as my libertarian friends understand, anytime you get beyond a binary option, someone is going to call you a spoiler, and voters have to decide between picking the candidate they like the most or worrying they might help elect the person they like least. And when you pull that dynamic into an 11-candidate Democratic Party primary like you had in New York City, things become ever more complicated for voters. All that choice becomes a problem. It changes campaigns, and candidates know that they can win with maybe a quarter of the vote. They go negative. Voters can't tell who's in second, third, fourth place. They don't know if they can vote for their favorite or if they have to settle for somebody else. That's not the kind of race we had in New York City. And this isn't about who won. It's about the kind of election experience that was put before voters. This was a decidedly better campaign. I've never quite seen anything exactly like it. Mamdani and Brad Lander on the couch at Stephen Colbert together. You had candidates who spent the final days, cross-endorsing one another, campaigning alongside one another, organizations and media outlets that made ranked endorsements, offering more preferences, more information on their preferences to voters. We saw candidates raising money together. We saw them doing joint social media posts together, walking arm in arm, talking about how their opponents could also help the city. And ranked choice made this possible. I would put it this way. The polls did not look good for any of the progressives or anybody who was not named Andrew Cuomo in this race very early on in the winter. You go back to February, you had an Emerson poll that showed Cuomo at the 23-point lead in a hypothetical matchup that none of the progressives even approached double digits. Mamdani, then an unknown assemblyman, polled at 1%. Right in the days before this, before RCV, I think what you would have seen would be like-minded candidates would have drawn sharp distinctions between each other. Party officials would have looked to nudge candidates toward the exits behind closed doors. Before any votes had been cast in the primary, the party would try to consolidate behind just one choice. It would have been bloody, left a bitter taste, and voters wouldn't have had any ability to weigh in themselves and to actually hear from these candidates. RCV encouraged and incentivized the process that Mamdani used, right? He energized young people. He reached voters where they are on social media. He built a coalition. He and his volunteers got out and they talked to everybody everywhere. This was a super long shot candidacy that might have been squelched before it even got off the ground under the old system with different incentives. I think this is an election that shows how much more power voters have under ranked choice voting. Voters were happier with this election. It's a Survey USA poll. 96% of voters said ranked choice is easy. 76% in New York said let's keep it or expand it. 81% said they understand it very well. 82% ranked 2 or more candidates. 45% of voters actually used all 5 of the ranking spots. Of those who ranked 1, they said 87% of them said that was the only candidate that they liked. So, fair enough. Participation soared. This was the second highest turnout in New York City history. It was the third highest was the 2021 race with RCV. This is the best turnout since 1989 in the David Dinkins race. It fell just 9,000 votes short of the record. It's the first time over 1 million voters came out since 1989. And I think what I would emphasize is that everyone had a voice. All of those voters had a genuine voice. You had 80% who ranked Mamdani or Cuomo first, but 95% of voters in this race had a preference between Mamdani and Cuomo, and ranked one of them on the ballot, which means that RCV led to a 15-point increase in the number of voters who helped decide the winner. That's an additional 160,000 New York voters. Under the old way of doing things, that would not have been the case. So I would say that, the voters always say, right, that they want more choice and candidates who engage with them in a genuine issue-based campaign. And they got that in New York this year because of ranked choice. And these turnout levels show that when voters get that kind of campaign, they show up, they get involved, they have the chance to consider new candidates, campaigning in creative new ways. The front runner with the early name recognition and the most donors can be eclipsed by a newcomer who started at 1%. So in a moment in which so many of our elections feel so fraught, so polarized, all of us who are looking, I think, for a more unified path forward, the politics of the future, as Mamdani called it when he declared victory, ought to take a look at what happened in New York, perhaps use that as proof that stronger elections are indeed possible.
Thank you, David. Now we'll hear from John.
Thank you, Walter, to my fellow panelists and to the Cato Institute for having me. I'm an RCV agnostic. The recent election in New York City has only strengthened that conviction for me, as I don't think RCV made all that much difference in the end. It's a modest reform with limited effects, and ascribing the June results to RCV, to my mind, risks committing the correlation causation fallacy. Now, I'm not anti-RCV, but I worry that fixating on it takes the emphasis away from other reforms that can make a bigger difference in boosting democratic participation and political competition, in reducing special interest influence, and in aligning outcomes with the will of the electoral majority. The recent primary exposes serious deficiencies with New York's electoral system, and RCV can't fix those problems, especially its fully closed partisan primaries and odd-year local races. Even after a significant increase in turnout, only about 32% of eligible Democrats participated this June. 1.78 million voters who aren't registered as Democrats had no voice. They couldn't participate in any mayoral primary because the Republicans did not hold a primary, and nor did any other party. And there are 1 million registered voters that are unaffiliated with any party who can never vote in a party primary. So just about everyone, myself included, thought that June's results would take weeks to calculate because multiple rounds of ranked choice elimination would be necessary to declare a winner. That did not happen. Zohran Mamdani essentially won on the strength of his first round votes, capturing 44% on primary night, showing just how little rankings mattered, at least for the way that people actually voted. Only 5% of votes were exhausted, meaning that the vast majority of voters put Cuomo or Mamdani on their ballots somewhere. At bottom, this was a two-person race, and the results would have been much the same under a traditional plurality race. Under the old pre-RCV system in New York, there would not have been a runoff election because Mamdani cleared 40% easily. And despite the unexpectedly wide nature of Mamdani's victory, his final round support represented only 11% of the city's total registered voters. That's hardly a mandate for socialism. So he's heading into the November general election as the odds-on favorite, having only won a sliver of the city's total electorate. Sure, the Mamdani campaign and its allies were successful in their Don't Rank Cuomo effort, as Walter mentioned. Most voters didn't rank Cuomo, but that's not really surprising if you look at the underlying political dynamics. Cuomo ran as a moderate, mostly against a field of progressives, whose supporters weren't likely to vote for him under any system. The Don't Rank Cuomo effort was successful really in avoiding voter confusion. RCV might have made a difference in keeping some marginal candidates in the race who, in a plurality system, might have dropped out and endorsed one of the frontrunners. Jessica Ramos did that for Cuomo, for example. But it's reasonable to think that these candidates took up time and attention voters might have used to scrutinize the frontrunners in other ways. That's just a trade-off. The bottom 5 candidates underperformed their polling expectations. I'll also grant that RCV made a difference with Brad Lander's cross-endorsement of Mamdani, also as Walter mentioned. It boosted their respective campaigns, but I think it boosted Mamdani's much more. I don't buy that the Working Family Party's slate, which put Mamdani first, really helped anyone in that slate except him. Now, what really mattered in this election was a closed primary that gave Mamdani an edge by preventing moderates and conservatives from voting, and just good politicking from Mamdani, good campaign quality, messaging, and outreach. Mamdani simply ran a much better campaign than Cuomo or the other competitors. He had brilliant social media videos, easily digestible platforms like Freeze the Rent, and an army of over 45,000 volunteers who knocked on doors as early as the fall to drive voter registration and turnout. So what accounts for the higher turnout? Well, I think Mamdani's campaign did the heavy lifting, not RCV, indicated by his top rank strength. This was a contentious, high-profile race with a candidate who mobilized ethnic groups like South Asians and young progressive New Yorkers in ways that other candidates haven't in the past, including by registering 37,000 new voters in just the 2 weeks prior to the primary registration deadline. Now that's 12 times, roughly, the figure from 2021. But now the far left in New York has come together to oppose primary reform, which really would offer meaningful differences to the million unaffiliated voters who can't vote and thus get skipped over by primary campaigns. After Mamdani's win, the Democratic Socialists of America, the Working Families Party, Brad Landers, and others on the left testified at the Charter Revision Commission to oppose a proposal for an all-candidate primary in which the top 2 vote-getters would advance to a general election runoff. The Working Families Party even threatened to sue the commission if it advanced that proposal to voters this November. So now voters aren't getting the option to replace the status quo with a more open system that would encourage candidates to appeal to a broader and more representative electorate. I consider that a major letdown. And I'll note that the commission made sure to incorporate RCV in its proposal. I testified multiple times at that commission, and I favored retaining RCV, using its bottoms-up variety to select the top 2 vote-getters. Now, that's not necessarily because I think RCV is essential or the best system, but because I don't think it's worth jeopardizing more important electoral reforms by alienating RCV supporters. So, in all, I believe that New York's results corroborate what research has shown that RCV is a modest procedural change with modest results. Lee Drutman and Marissa Strano of New America wrote a literature review on RCV a few years ago and found a pattern of null to small effects. To my mind, it would be a mistake to think that this election confounds those results.
Thank you, John, and all of our panelists. I would like to invite all of us to react to themes that we've heard introduced by other panelists. Any takers?
Look, I think I agree with most of what everyone has said. I don't think that ranked choice voting is likely to have terrible effects. I do worry about the thing I worry most about is the potential, especially if it becomes more widespread, to weaken the parties at the national level in a way that I think seems appealing given how dysfunctional they are, but might be bad. But I think the best assessment of it is on the margin, it might encourage some slightly more intra-party coalitions in campaigning, and it might make voters more satisfied with their experience, which is good. Voter satisfaction is good. But I think that we often tend to hope that it will fix much deeper problems in our politics. And I'm deeply skeptical of that. This is also true of proportional representation, which can be good and can be bad, seems to work in some countries, seems to work really badly in other countries. And that most broadly, we tend to want political reforms to fix deeper problems in our society than they can really handle.
Your point, Megan, about parties in really holds particular salience in local elections in municipalities, because local elections don't neatly hew left, right, Democrat, Republican in any meaningful way. At least you can't really assemble a principled platform for local issues. But think of something like parks administration, right? That's not really an issue that bifurcates along partisan lines. And yet, in New York City, we are basically forced to litigate our political differences through a single party. It's all basically run through the Democratic Party primary. And I think that is quite deleterious to giving voters a say on the issues that they care about most. So if voters really cared about, for example, getting buses and trains to run on time, to run faster, maybe they could have their own party to voice those concerns, but they really can't split off because of the closed primary system that we have. And so I could see moving to a party-friendly system being quite helpful in a place like New York City. In fact, in my advocacy before the Charter Revision Commission and elsewhere, I recommend giving parties the control over the use of their label on ballots. So the party committees or internal party processes should be the ones to determine who gets to use the party label. And this would strengthen party discipline. And if someone within that party doesn't like the decision that the committee makes, well, there's always a chance to go off and form a new party. And I see the Democratic Socialists in New York City and in other cities as essentially a different kind of political entity than the Democratic Party, right? They are far to the left of an institutional Democrat like Andrew Cuomo or even Mayor Eric Adams. And so I would rather see them compete as a party with a consistent party line, party platform, and candidates against the Democratic Party and against a whole medley of other local parties that could allow voters to express their concerns and their differences.
Yeah, I don't think anybody is coming on here today to say that ranked choice voting is the cure to all that ails our politics and a panacea that immediately returns us to a politics of hope and joy and complete unity. I think what we're saying is that it's a tool that is really powerful for voters when they've got more than two choices in any election to push us towards a majority result. And that's extraordinarily useful, especially in party primaries. That a party primary like this with 11 candidates could well have been won by somebody with 21, 22% of the vote. Megan and I are both in Massachusetts, and there have been congressional primaries here in Massachusetts that are very similar to the New York mayoral's race, right? If you win the congressional a Democratic primary, you are essentially going on to Congress with a fraction of voters in the district, as John said. And people win these races with 22, 23% of the vote. That's happened twice in the last 6 or 7 years. And then they coast straight on into office, and they are essentially incentivized to serve that, slender portion of the primary electorate, rather than having to build the kind of coalition that gets you towards 51%. And that can create a different kind of campaign, a different kind of dynamic, and it doesn't necessarily lead to more moderate people winning, but it leads to somebody winning who actually genuinely has to campaign and win majority support. And that in this country in this moment seems to me to be a really worthwhile thing. There are many other really valid and important political reforms. I would agree with John on the need for more open primaries. I think I would go a step further on top two. I think top four is a stronger way to go that gives voters more choice and options, and eliminates the possibility that we've seen in California and Washington of some places of two members of the same party taking both of those spots. But to me, what just happened here is that a candidate who is at 1% in the polls in the early going, exactly the kind of candidate who John might have suggested was in the bottom five, just taking up space at one point in time, got to be heard, got to campaign, was not pushed out of the way, and voters were able to hear this and make the decision. Would he have? Does it turn out that he would have won the ultimate race without RCV? Yes, he wins in the 40s and Cuomo's in the mid 30s. But I'm not sure this campaign gets off the ground without RCV, and that to me is a valuable thing for being sure that voters are really deciding at these elections, and not the candidate with the most money and the highest name recognition at the beginning of a race.
I just want to point out that.
No, go ahead, John.
Thank you. Just a quick note that Democratic primaries before the adoption of RCV did have multiple contenders, some more viable than others. I believe in 2001, where there was no incumbent, the election had 5 candidates in the Democratic primary. There were 6, I believe, in 2005. In 2013, you had a very crowded field, something like 9 candidates then. And that in 2013, of course, there was also a race without an incumbent. So I don't necessarily think that RCV, is something that really that supercharges, say, candidates' ability to remain in the race, given this historical record that we have. But on the margins, I do think that it incentivizes candidates to remain in the race rather than to drop out and endorse. We could have had Brad Lander simply drop out and endorse Zohran Mamdani with similar effects.
And I will add, in response to several points that have been made, in order to get very far analyzing this, you quickly run into the confounding respects in which it is combined with other electoral reforms or not applied to the entire process. And in New York, for example, it is applied to primaries, but not to the general election. And noodling around the RCV literature, it seems clear that it behaves rather differently in primaries than in general elections. Obviously, this spoiler third party issue, which is so important for general elections, is not typically present in primaries. The effects on parties may be different and so forth. So bear in mind, New York doesn't use it for the general election. And I know we've already got a couple of questions saying, why doesn't New York adopt it for the general election? I will say from Arlington, Virginia, which is close to where I am in the DC area, it was interesting that they adopted RCV for primaries and not for the general. And when quizzed, the party leaders kind of gave away the game, which was that they were afraid that if they introduced it for generals, that a Republican might slip in because Republicans were just strong enough to. I wonder whether some similar calculation is at work in New York. And Arlington used a top two system in which there were two seats and both won. Now, how did that work out in Arlington? Well, recently in a community and in a Democratic Party that was riven by development issues, with a very strongly pro-development and a very strongly anti-development faction. It elected one of each. That's what voters seem to want, and that's what RCV delivered in the particular format for multi-seat races. But that was actually, so at least I have heard through the grapevine, that was seen as good by the Arlington County Democratic Party because it, papered over or even healed a party division. It meant that the Democratic Party officially included people on both sides of that incredibly divisive local issue. So that brings us to Megan's point about how it affects parties. And I have to say, this has been one of my big concerns when I had a chance to talk to a panel of Alaska people recounting their experience. That was my question, was is it felt that parties in Alaska are stronger or weaker? Now, the big confounding factor there is that Alaska has the universal nonpartisan primary where everyone runs in the same primary. And that probably would swamp RCV. It intuitively has bigger effects on the parties to kick them out of the primary business than it does to bring in RCV at either the primary or the general stage. And the answer that I got was that it was too early to tell. One answer that I have heard more than once about more than one system is that the parties feel that they have already lost control over many of the basics here. They have lost control over who gets nominated because people come in with a huge war chest or with the ability to get lots of media, and they steamroll whoever the party actually preferred when it comes down to the longtime party activists who might go to a convention or something. And so the argument was, you're talking about something that we lost 10 or 20 years ago, and it can't get worse as far as the ability to have people parachute in and take our nominations. The other thing, though, is that a point that John made in passing about whether or not parties retain the ability to put a seal of approval, which can be our convention favored this candidate or even favored these two candidates as the ones who did the best at the convention, or simply, you may have these other people on the ballot, but we don't consider them good Democrats or good Republicans. That could change the dynamics a lot. And I don't think we necessarily have enough data points of that being introduced to know how well how much leverage it gives parties. And finally, just responding to Megan's point, what I concluded after asking this question of a lot of people involved was that what has taken power away from the parties is not mostly the things we've just been talking about. One of the reasons for that is that campaign finance has been so important in taking away power from the parties, and it was going to usher in the rule of the small donors, and it did, and it's awful. The small donors, were a terrible influence. I'm sorry, I'm obviously editorializing, but that and a bunch of other things, most of them well intentioned, but more on the campaign finance side, and occasionally in other legal areas, rather than what we've been discussing, have enervated the parties. And so Uh, the other point that people have made, which I think is a good one, is that strength of parties has is not as easily affected by changes in local laws. Yes, you can do some things with fusion. You might be able to get the Working Families Party to come into your state or to stay out of your state, depending on how few rules like fusion work. But by and large, a lot of the party apparatus that is there because being active in a local party gets you a ticket to a national convention. People want that even if the local party has been completely denuded of any useful local power. They still want to participate in a major party at the local level because of that. And so it was argued, unless you have a national change in election rules, you're only going to have fairly minor effects on the strength of parties locally. More comments?
I mean, I would certainly agree that there are bigger issues, right? But I think that's a lot of what we're all saying. There are bigger issues. That we have a lot of problems. They're downstream of a lot of things. And I guess I would just say that, like, every single one of the reforms that has produced bad outcomes sounded good to me at the time. Term limits is another example. And that is why I am naturally suspicious of any idea to change something. And but that said, I mean, as changes go, seems like a relatively harmless one. On the other hand, I would just say that as changes go, so did all the other changes that turned out to not be harmless at all.
And I think we should also bear in mind that there are limits to electoral reform. I mean, Zohran Mamdani really ran an innovative campaign with social media, with the ground game that was really unprecedented. He, I think, would have succeeded in any number of different electoral systems. And he was outspent 3-1 if you consider independent expenditures as well, because Governor Cuomo's campaign was simply out of date. It was a 20-year-old style campaign, focusing very heavily on television ads and direct mailers, as opposed to Assemblyman Mamdani, who was able to walk the streets, get video clips, and have them edited in a dramatic, flashy, appealing way within the same day, right? And the outreach effort, combined with that to produce dramatic effects. People got the message, especially because it was a very simple message of freezing the rent and fast and free buses, etc. The other thing, to Walter's point about why is RCV used in the primary, I think it was essentially a tacit nod that the primary is almost always the only election that matters in New York City, because of the uncompetitive nature of our general elections. And we have a really skewed electorate, like in many blue cities. Democrats outnumber Republicans something like over 6-1. So it's normally not competitive in November. It was not competitive in 2021. So all the action is essentially in the Democratic Party primary. And I do worry that those on the left who have benefited from RCV or just from the dynamic that closed primaries create, especially, that they use RCV as a pretext to say, well, we have this progressive modern system in place. We've used it effectively to boost turnout. Therefore, we don't need to change anything else. That was essentially the main thrust of the testimony in the Charter Revision Commission. Well, there are still, 35% of New Yorkers who weren't able to weigh in June. And I think opening up that system would certainly have changed the incentives and the outcome.
I think I see that a little differently. I think I see that as party primaries are perhaps the most important place to try out something like this, when that's where all the action is, because otherwise it's much easier for a small percentage to hijack something and win. So it becomes all the more important to have a tool like this in place in party primaries in order to get a better, fairer, more majoritarian result out of the election that matters most. I'd certainly love to see it expanded into a general election, especially this year. It seems as if there could still be 3, 4, 5 choices. So it would be an especially valuable tool. With regard to other reforms, I'm certainly not an expert on what's happened in the charter process in New York, but I think we all know that timing is often everything in politics and with change. And I think when in the immediate days after this win, that people went before the Charter Commission advocating wholesale changes and additions, perhaps it's not entirely surprising that some of those changes were looked at and where they were coming from with a couple of raised eyebrows. But I do think that these are good reforms. Open primaries are good reforms, important reforms, and we ought to keep working towards them and building those coalitions towards winning them.
I'll just note that the Charter Revision Commission was going on for the whole year and just took on a different salience when Mamdani won. It took the appearance of the attempt to thwart a repeat victory for someone like Mamdani, which I don't think it was.
We should get soon to questions from the audience, because I know there have been a lot of questions. I'll make one more point before we do that, if I could, which is that ranked choice voting was on the ballot this last fall and went down to almost unanimous defeat at the statewide level, where it was typically paired with ambitious universal primary, nonpartisan primary schemes. The public voted that down just about everywhere, although it preserved it in Alaska. But it did extremely well in municipal adoptions. And so now we are looking at an emerging pattern in which states and most of the country outside big cities is somewhat resistant to RCV, perhaps because they associate it with nonpartisan primaries, which is its own issue. But big cities are very much on the march and continue adopting rapidly. Now, those big cities typically either have had nonpartisan municipal elections or have had municipal elections totally dominated by the Democratic primary, as several people have said. Winner of Democratic primary wins it. So it could be that that's the use case for ranked choice voting, in which you get 70 or 80 or 85% approval from the public. It's that they're so tired of only having one round. Some of these cities had runoffs, in which case you're comparing RCV with the runoff system. We're probably all familiar with the arguments. It's runoffs have low turnout and they're expensive to get all the polling places, and the campaign has to go out and spend money. Nonetheless, that's the group that has decided that they want to go full speed ahead, as residents of big cities who have faced exactly that problem. Now, that having been said, the audience has been waiting very patiently to get in. I want to pick a question from Chris Hesse, because it hasn't come up so far, but I think it's a very interesting one, which is, what about how fast things are tabulated? In this age of computers, why wouldn't we know the results right away? Someone should explain the special reasons why New York City has faced tremendous problems in speed of tabulation, but also why it seemed to go better this year, if I'm right that it did go better this year. Anyone want to explain that or talk about it?
I think John would probably agree that New York City's election administration is not always at its most swift, right? The problem that occurred in 2021 was not a ranked choice voting problem. It was an error on behalf of election tabulation, as done by election administrators in New York City. It is pretty easy and quick to actually tabulate RCV results. The ability to get this done is pretty fast and sophisticated on modern voting machines. The quirks that have happened with some slower returns tend to be the problem of voting in Maine and Alaska, which have far-flung places in which sometimes votes are being returned and counted by planes, and where there's all kinds of rules built in. In New York City, things were slowed down because there are laws about being sure that all mail-in absentee ballots are in and counted before this was processed. But RCV results can be delivered and tabulated quickly. It's up to election administrators and the individual rules in those states about how quickly things are or are not released to the public.
I agree with that assessment, and certainly that the New York City Board of Elections has been in dire need of reform for many decades now. It is, you could say, the last vestige of Tammany Hall in its purest form, where it's a body that is composed of political appointees by the party machines in each of the 5 boroughs, 1 Democrat and 1 Republican. So you have 10 commissioners. They don't tend to have professional election administration experience, and that shows. So for many decades, there have been calls to reform the Board of Elections, not to much success because of patronage purposes. And I do think that any electoral reforms that the city adopts would underscore the need for more professional administration as just a good government measure.
Okay. We have a question, especially for Megan, from David Green. I feel sure that we will all have opinions on the subject, though, which is on the subject of how parties do. We have the experience with Maine and Alaska. Now, and I'm summarizing David's question, but in Maine, not much apparent effect of any sort. In Alaska, which of course also has the universal primary idea, which is having its own effect. But in Alaska, it's produced something that has been seen in no other state, which is bipartisan coalitions in both houses of the state legislature. Now, Alaska also applies this system to all the state legislative races. Maine has only been doing it for some elections. Alaska applies it across the board, and it has gotten this unique result. And I guess the answer is this a result we should applaud? Is it more due to the universal primary than to the ranked choice aspect? But everyone is welcome to answer.
I mean, I would say that they're both slightly odd states, rural, low population. And I think that, look, a lot of the questions I have come out of where we are already. And I don't know, maybe ranked choice voting would solve those problems, and then we wouldn't be in this place anymore. But, I think a lot of our problems right now are actually downstream of the changing media environment. And of course, I would say that because I work for a legacy newspaper, but that every race is now national at the national level and even increasingly at the local level. I think that is somewhat less true in Maine and Alaska, precisely because they are like relatively isolated than it is in, say, New York, where you get often races being run on national questions for local officials, and where the brand is about national issues, and that those national brands are poisonous. And I would also look at things like, look, there's 2 ways you could argue this. One is that Congress is so dysfunctional that it couldn't get worse. That's a fair argument, although I will point out that it can always get worse. But that you have these complicated things like the budget process, like the debt ceiling, that are currently only being barely shoved through because of party discipline, where the ability to hold these coalitions together, however weak and however driven by primary challenges and all of the rest of it, that's the only reason we are making this totally broken budget process work as well as it is, which is to say really, really badly. So if you have people who are even less kind of invested in the party infrastructure, less beholden to kind of clear constituencies, where most people in Congress have a group of fairly similar constituencies, depending on what state they're in, I don't know how that cashes out. And maybe this is a paranoid fear and it's overblown. And it just grows out of my having spent the last 10 to 15 years of my career watching Congress get more and more and more dysfunctional, that when I look at all of the good government reforms that have been not the only thing that created this, I really do think that both social media and more broadly, kind of the decline of old local newspapers, the spread of everything to national outlets, and then the fragmentation of those national outlets into 1,000 pieces, I think that's also a big part of it. But like virtually every good government reform that has been supposed to make Congress better, from earmarks to term limits at local levels to, as we said, campaign finance reform, primaries, et cetera, have instead made it much worse. And I just have at this point, like, my reflexive PTSD when someone says, I've got a good government reform. I'm like, no. And maybe that's, just me overreacting to past experience, but.
David, John, any more thoughts?
I think Maine and Alaska are so interesting because they are states that have these deep traditions of independent politics and non-traditional politics and third, fourth, and fifth parties. And these are states that really wanted to still have a majority winner while also valuing the number of choices that they had. So I think that's why you see these emerge there, and why they've been defended by voters, even when the political establishments in the state have tried to shut them down. With regard to political reform, I guess I just don't see any political reform as a stopping point, or as a permanent answer. Whenever you enact a political reform, those who want to find a way around it or to use and abuse the system are going to attempt to do so. And those who believe in good government and reforms have to still be on the job of trying to adjust. So whenever a reform is made, right, it can't be the only thing, or it can't be put into place and then just left there. There will always be adjustments made by those who want to hold on to power in a way that they've become accustomed to, and we have to continue to watch and continue to reform, hopefully in a positive way and not in a way that makes us paranoid and freak out, right? But certainly some of these reforms have had disadvantages. We can see it in our politics, but I would say it's less the problem of the reform than the cause of those in office trying to twist the reform in order to hold on to their own positions.
Add a brief technical point, and one other. In terms of a majority winner for ranked choice voting, that is a majority of the final round votes, not necessarily of the total votes cast. If you have a race where there are many exhausted ballots, meaning that many voters did not rank one of the last two contenders before a victor emerged, then you could have a race where the victor does not have a majority of the total vote share. In New York, we did not have as high of an exhausted ballot proportion because we only had 5% this year. So most voters, like I said, did rank Cuomo or Mamdani or both. So their vote was not exhausted before the last two rounds, the last round of elimination with the last two candidates. In terms of Alaska, I see Alaska, like Megan and David said, as an idiosyncratic state with idiosyncratic politics. But I will note that given the fractured media landscape that Megan mentioned, information cues for voters are even more important. Voters don't do a whole lot of homework on average before they vote. I wish that they did. We could all hope that everyone did their civic homework before getting to the ballot box. That isn't always the case, and having immediate information cues on ballots is very important, and I think especially important for ranked choice voting, because ranked choice voting essentially asks of voters to select up to 5 candidates, at least in New York, it's up to 5, and put them in an order of preference. Now, that could be really hard for voters to get enough information about each of those candidates to form an opinion about which is better than the other and in what order. So having immediate information cues on ballots can help voters navigate this difficult, fractured media landscape and make decisions that most genuinely reflect their preferences and their values.
Certainly agreed on the fractured media landscape. I think I would just quickly add that in a single choice election, your ballot is exhausted after your first vote.
Sure.
So in a ranked choice rate, you at least have the opportunity to have to weigh in on the final election, as an additional 160,000 New Yorkers were able to this year.
Agreed.
And I'll just throw in that the law varies locally and between countries on this. I believe there are states that allow candidates to put in like a message of up to 6 words or 50 characters or something, explaining why they're running. And that could provide one way of getting cues out there to voters as to the difference between unknown names that they're encountering for the first time. But I'd like to move on, if I could. A lot of the questions, and we've had dozens of questions, let me apologize in advance that we're not going to get to most of them, but a whole lot of the questions are about other reforms, sometimes how they tie in with ranked choice voting, sometimes whether they would be good substitutes for ranked choice voting, as with approval and Condorcet voting. But I want to start with a question from about 6 people on proportional representation, which is, tell us about the ways in which ranked choice voting can be arranged to further proportional representation. Do you like it? Should we be moving in that direction? And I'll just say briefly, by way of explanation for those who may not have followed this, that ordinary ranked choice voting for single seats does not tend to produce proportional representation. As soon as you move to a multi-seat system, although there are multiple ways you can set it up, a couple of the most popular ways will tend to generate a PR-like effect when you are doing ranked choice voting for, let's say, 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 things. And that indeed, I believe, is part of the Portland, Oregon reforms. It has been tried in 1 or 2 other places like Cambridge, Massachusetts, and it's also important in overseas. And so that leads us to the question of, do we like proportional representation? And like Megan, I have mixed feelings. In the remaining 7 minutes, there's no way I can explain all of my own pros and cons, but I will instead turn to something that we've touched on, but not really had anyone as a full-throated advocate, which is America's genius of federalism, those Brandeisian laboratories of democracy. Like Megan, I am kind of scared about introducing anything too innovative to the whole country at once. That way leads a lot of possible downside. But for those same reasons, I'm actually kind of giddy about introducing things in a couple of states and seeing how they work. So my last word on proportional representation is, I hope that a couple of states adopt it, at least for one chamber in their legislatures, because I would love to see how it interacts with American electoral institutions. But how about the rest of you? What do you think?
I think proportional representation, I think, seems unlikely to me. As far as I can tell, it would require a constitutional amendment to do at the national level. At the local level, I think it's fine, and indeed many cities do have, right? They elect their city councils citywide rather than in single member districts. It doesn't seem obvious that it's a terrible system, but I think, when we go back to what we're saying about Maine and Alaska, right? It's very hard to tease out effects like that from other local things, such as the fact that Alaska really does have this long tradition of kind of political independence, and so does Maine, right, which has elected independent senators to Congress, independent governors, and so forth. And so similarly, right, if you have a city that is doing proportional representation, that's likely to tell you quite a lot about what the city is like and who lives there, in part because these reforms are most interesting to highly educated progressives, right? And that in turn, it's going to be hard to tease out those effects from other things that are going on. Not impossible, because there are cities that have had citywide councils for quite a while, but it does confound things. And I would add that aside from the difficulty of passing a constitutional amendment, my sense is that proportional representation in the United States got a huge amount of its juice from progressives who thought that Republicans had gerrymandered a minority into an electoral majority. And therefore, they got really interested in proportional representation. And that's not true anymore. And I think that your political constituency for it, quite apart from the effectiveness of it, has kind of gone away, or will when they notice that the Republican kind of bias in the Electoral College is no longer there, and it doesn't really benefit Democrats to move to proportional representation right now. That could again change, but.
Well, as far as gerrymandering of House seats in states, I would have said with some confidence only weeks ago that we now had a fairly evenly balanced system in which neither party was getting more from gerrymandering. But, of course, you can't speak about elections these days without immediately finding yourself incorrect. And we may find by this fall that Republican advantage has reasserted itself. David, John?
The advantage, well, I think John and I are both interested in the experiment happening right now in Portland very much. I think that's a very interesting laboratory of democracy question that's at work there. But I would say that I think proportional representation has an awful lot of benefits in this moment, and that it wouldn't be as difficult as a constitutional amendment, that we could do this for the U.S. House, simple as overturning the 1967, I believe it is, statute that set up and mandated single member districts. That's really all it would take, and then a legislation from there. But that what we're seeing with regards to the national House map, there's no such thing as a national House map, right? It's made up of a bunch of individually gerrymandered and jerry-rigged state maps. And so we have achieved some sort of temporary balance in the 2022 and 2024 elections, but that was achieved only by Illinois going crazy and North Carolina going crazy, and all of these states pushing things not as far as they could, as we've seen this week, but nearly almost as far as they could. And that's lousy if you're a Republican in Illinois, or if you're a Democrat in North Carolina, that all of these people still deserve representation and to vote in meaningful elections and to feel like their vote is being heard. And that a map that achieves national balance through maximal gerrymanders in blue states and red states is not good for our politics, not good for democracy, not good for voters.
I think proportional representation holds unique promise in American cities, but I generally favor the open list proportional representation system and not the single transferable vote system that uses ranked choice voting. And the reason is history. Jack Santucci, a political scientist and Manhattan Institute adjunct fellow, has written extensively about the history of the single transferable vote, which is now in use in Portland, in the United States. And in the mid-20th century, about 24 cities adopted STV. All but one, but Cambridge, Massachusetts, repealed that system. New York City had a single transferable vote system for the city council from 1937 to 47, and also repealed. What tends to happen in these situations is that vote transfers occur in unexpected ways, such that people get very skeptical of the outcomes. That's a phenomenon known as vote leakage. So if you have, let's say, voters go from a Green Party to a Republican Party because, I don't know, the Republican Party is in favor of building a lot more housing in New York City as a pro-market reform, and building a lot of housing would reduce carbon emissions in New York City by drawing people to the lowest emitting jurisdiction in the nation, which New York City is. Let's say that happened, people would say, well, that seems very counterintuitive. We don't like that. We're going to get rid of it. And the two-party system, the major parties band together to oppose it. Now, open list proportional representation is quite different. It does not use ranked choice. It instead takes parties as part of the electoral infrastructure. So parties would be the one to nominate candidates, but voters could get a choice among the candidates that parties nominate. So voters could select one candidate under a party's column, that those candidates again selected by the party, but the candidate with the most votes from that column would be the first elected if that party were to reach a threshold to win seats in the city council or another assembly. So proportional representation can give voice to many voters who feel that their particular concerns on a single issue aren't being addressed by the current system. And I think it would allow for more flexible, dynamic politics, for shifting coalitions of support, for parties to hold discipline in the eventual legislature and carve out deals between the various parties.
Okay. We have gone over time, but I know that one or two of us have final thing they want to say before I thank everyone. Megan, did you want to say something?
I just have a correction. I misremembered about a constitutional amendment. I have egg on my face, and I apologize to listeners who perhaps got a wrong idea, and thank David for correcting me so kindly rather than calling me an idiot.
Okay, we appreciate how civil and collegial everyone has been. We are past our running time, though, so at this point I need to thank all of you in the audience. Very sorry we couldn't get to many good questions. Thank our panelists, and this program will be available as a video on the Cato website after a few days probably, and thank you all for attending.